You know the B-25, the famous twin-engine bomber that served a crucial role for the US, bombing and strafing enemy targets into submission across all theaters of World War II. But in this video, we will cover some things that you may not know, the fascinating details that history can often overlook. So here are 5 relatively unknown facts about the B-25 bomber. As part of our research on the B-25, my crew and I had to head out to the CAF Air Base Arizona for the in-depth commentary you are about to see. This trip was only made possible by this video's sponsor, Bespoke Post. In case you don't know, Bespoke Post is the monthly membership club that delivers a box of awesome to you. Anything from outdoor gear, home and kitchen goods, clothing, and much more. You just sign up, take their preference quiz so they can customize your box, and then they will send you a preview of your box each month before it ships. You can then keep it, swap it, or skip that month at no cost. Each box of awesome has around $70 worth of items, but only cost a fraction of that to you. To show you some of the great stuff that I have gotten so far, last month for my frequent traveling for interviews, I got the Weekender box, which had this classy travel bag. And this month, being the history buff I am, I got an actual scrimshaw kit, so I can carve out some beautiful art like the seafaring men of old. So, if this sounds like something for you, go to bespokepost.com/TJ3History20 and enter TJ3History20 at checkout to get 20% off your first box of awesome. So don't wait, join Bespoke Post today. Without further ado, enjoy. To start off our list for today, we will look at an interesting characteristic of the B-25 that makes it a rather unique design. Its one-of-a-kind wings. Now, most of you know the F4U Corsair and its inverted gull wing. But what you probably don't know is that the B-25 also has a gull wing, only its shape is the opposite of the Corsair. When the B-25 was originally designed and produced, the first 9 aircraft had a consistent wing dihedral, meaning that the wing had a constant upward angle from the fuselage to the wingtip, like most of the other bombers during this time. But it was soon discovered that this was actually causing problems with the stability of the aircraft, making it clear that a change needed to be made.
So the original B-25 and the prototype as well had a constant dihedral, which is of course the angle that the wings make with the fuselage. During flight testing of the original B-25s, they found out that it had a Dutch roll characteristic, which caused it to be unsuitable for accurate bombing. By lowering the dihedral somehow, the engineers figured out that it got rid of the Dutch roll characteristic. So actually the first 10 B-25s were built with a constant dihedral. Starting with the 11th B-25, they had the lower dihedral outboard the engines, which gives it a very distinctive look. Somewhere I have a picture of one of the first 10 B-25s parked next to one of the later B-25s, and you can really see the difference.
After this change was made, the B-25 would become known as a safe and forgiving aircraft to fly, thanks to its unique and recognizable wing shape. Up next, we will go to a story within the mission of the Doolittle Raiders that often gets forgotten in the tales of this famous endeavor. This would occur after they had taken off from the USS Hornet and after they had bombed Tokyo. Also, another bonus fact here, did you know that in the Doolittle raid, the American gunners actually claimed to have shot down 3 Japanese fighters? Oftentimes, when this story is retold or recreated in the movies, there is no combat over mainland Japan. But in reality, the Doolittle Raiders were indeed engaged by fighters, and they are believed to have shot down 3 of the interceptors. At this time, however, the aircraft that were stationed over Tokyo were very inexperienced and green pilots, which is why they really did not give any trouble to the Raiders over mainland Japan. After this famous raid, however, when the Americans bombed the capital city of Japan, they did indeed station multiple squadrons of their most skilled aces over Tokyo to protect from any possible future raids. This would prove to be a positive result for the Americans after this raid, as Japan desperately needed fighter pilots late in the war, and they were forced to keep some of their valued aces over their capital city because of this raid. But back to the main story. After the raiders hit their targets in Tokyo and flew over the ocean to arrive in China, one of the bombers would actually end up landing in the Soviet Union. This aircraft, flown by Captain Edward York, would be the only plane to successfully land intact. This is not the forgotten story though, but instead their subsequent escape and eventual arrival back in the United States. As these 5 American aircrew members came out of their aircraft, they were actually taken into custody by the Soviet Union. Although at this time the United States was an ally with the USSR, Joseph Stalin actually had a firm peace agreement in place with Japan at this time. And since the Soviet Union was vulnerable to attack from Japan, it was crucial that they maintain this relationship, so they did not bring about another war to their border. This would obviously put the Soviets in a difficult situation, as they wanted to return the Allied crew members, but did not want to potentially start another war. Thus, Captain York and his men would be taken prisoner, where they were treated well by their captors, and after several months, they were transferred to a prison in Ashgabat in present-day Turkmenistan, which just so happened to be 20 miles from the British-controlled Iranian border. Then, on May 11th of 1943, more than a year after their famous raid on Tokyo, these prisoners would escape from their Soviet prison through a bribe of a prison official by Captain York, where they would thereafter make it across Allied lines and into the hands of the British. In the years after World War II, when documents were declassified, it was confirmed that the Soviet organization that managed prisoners, the NKVD, staged the smuggling on purpose to free their Allied captives, and that the bribery was a cover story to protect their peace agreement with Japan. These Doolittle Raiders would make it back to the United States, where they were hailed as heroes, completing one of the more fascinating stories in the history of the United States and Soviet relations. Up next, we will go to a negative aspect of the B-25 for its pilots that has rarely been covered: the deafening noise of the aircraft that actually did long-term damage to many of its airmen. This would come about from the large size of the B-25 engine, the angle of its exhaust stacks, and the proximity of the propellers to the pilot and co-pilot.
With the B-25, the engines are mounted very close to the fuselage. And on the B-25, like on most combat aircraft, the exhaust are all very short stacks, maybe 5-6 inches long. There was a separate stack for each cylinder. There's 14 cylinders on each engine. So you can imagine there is no muffling of the sound whatsoever, and it's very, very loud. And of course, the propellers are right next to the pilots. So most B-25 pilots suffered hearing loss on one side or the other, depending upon whether you were a pilot or a co-pilot.
So I am here in the cockpit of B-25 bomber made in the shade. And despite me telling them that I promised I wouldn't fly it, I'm not technically allowed to sit in the cockpit. But what I am allowed to show you is that this propeller is right next to the pilot and the co-pilot. If I were sitting in this chair here flying this aircraft, I could very likely just stick my arm out and touch this propeller. That's how close that these engines and these props were to the airmen that were flying this aircraft. And so it can easily be seen how these would have been so loud that they would have actually caused both pilot and co-pilot to lose hearing as they served for long periods of time in the B-25.
This would go down as one of the few negative aspects of serving on board the famous B-25. At number 2 is the crucial conversion into a low-level ground attack aircraft and how exactly this new role came about. For background, the B-25 began the war as a medium-level bomber, This typically involved dropping its payload from around 5 to 10,000 feet. But as war progressed, specifically in the Pacific theater, it became apparent that a new kind of strategy was needed. And there was one man in particular who knew exactly what this new strategy should be, a US aviator by the name of Pappy Gunn.
So in the South Pacific, there was an Army captain called Paul Gunn, nicknamed Pappy Gunn, who came up with the idea of using B-25s as low-level attack aircraft, much like the A-20s. And he field modified a bunch of them to have extra guns in the nose. The problem with that is, of course, now you're destroying the weight and balance of the aircraft because you're putting all these heavy guns and all this heavy ammunition in the nose. And the guns are fired by the pilot. So in fact, rarely did you have a bombardier. You just had guns in the nose. The early ones, they would put a couple, 2, 3, 4, 50 calibers in the nose and maybe a 20 millimeter cannon. In order to compensate for all that extra weight in the nose, they would put lead in the back of the airplane to try to balance it, which of course made the airplane really, really heavy. And initially, Pappy Gunn was the only ones that could really fly the airplanes, but he trained the other pilots to fly them and they became very, very effective. And they were used all through the Pacific War in that fashion.
In addition to the ground strafing role, it was around this time that the military strategists also began to implement skip bombing to the US Army Air Force.
They developed a tactic called skip bombing, which they used against Japanese destroyers and Japanese barges, where you would come in low like a torpedo bomber using the forward-firing guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire, and you would skip a 500-pound bomb across the water, just like you skip a rock across the water. The bombs were delay fused by 5 seconds, so it gave them time to, after impact, to penetrate into the ship and explode. It was very, very effective. A lot easier to hit a target, a moving naval target that way than to try to bomb them from 5,000 to 10,000 feet.
This tactic was incredibly deadly because it was far more accurate than normal bombing, as it was essentially the same thing as making a torpedo run, but at a much higher speed. In addition, these bombs were also a lot cheaper to produce than the faulty American torpedoes, so it was also a cost-saving strategy as well. Shortly after this, US leaders realized that it was so successful that they tried to further the concept with a new strategy, adding even more guns.
Once George Kenney, who was in charge of the Air Force in the Pacific, realized what a great tool these were, he actually sent Pappy Gunn back to North America to consult with them on how to add even more guns to these strafers. And one of the ideas they came up with was to add guns to the side of the fuselage. They could mount them a little further back, thereby helping with the weight and balance problems. And they would all be fired by the pilot. So eventually, North American was producing B-25Js like what you see here, that had a solid nose with 8 50 caliber machine guns, plus 4 machine gun packs mounted on the side. So you had 12 50 caliber machine guns, all fired by the pilot. You come in at low level strafing, and you could cut down a forest. The way Kenney used them when he was attacking airfields is he would send in B-24s at 10,000 feet to bomb the runways. He would wait an hour for the Japanese to come out of their shelters, and then he'd send the B-25s in the treetop level to finish the job.
These new tactics created a new role for the B-25 to serve in, and it would fulfill this opening flawlessly. Finally, in the top spot for today is a bizarre and tragic story that history has long since forgotten involving the B-25. This would take place in July of 1945, and was actually not over the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific, but on the home front in downtown New York City. On this foggy Saturday morning, a B-25 took off from a US Army Air Force airfield in Massachusetts, headed for New Jersey on a normal personnel transport flight. As they approached their destination over New York City, the pilot requested clearance to land, but instead was advised of zero visibility. However, he decided to proceed anyway, which would prove to be a disastrous decision. As he passed the Chrysler Building over the city in the intense fog, he became disoriented and turned right instead of left, and unknowingly headed right for the Empire State Building. At 9:40 a.m., the aircraft crashed into the 79th floor of the iconic skyscraper, exploding upon impact. This would kill all 3 of the crew members on board the aircraft, as well as 11 people inside of the building. The fire would be quelled in 40 minutes, and the structure of the building was not compromised, preventing a disaster. In addition, however, this strange event would also actually set 2 records that still stand today. First, this fire would become the highest structural fire to ever be brought under control by firefighters. An impressive feat to stand unmatched for 80 years. But also, an elevator operator by the name of Betty Oliver, who was working in the building, would break a record as well. After the crash, Betty was thrown from her elevator car on the 80th floor and suffered severe burns. And then, later on, in a questionable decision, first responders who came to her aid following the crash opted to put her back on another elevator car to head to the ground for more medical attention. But, unbeknownst to them, the cables in this elevator had been damaged in the crash, and shortly after stepping in, broke and sent the elevator car plummeting from the 75th story, coming to rest in the basement. Although she had a broken pelvis, back, and neck, Betty Oliver would somehow survive, setting the record for the longest survived elevator fall in history. Following all of this, the Empire State Building would be open for business again on the following Monday, less than 48 hours later. Comment what plane I should cover next, and please consider subscribing.